We thank you so much for joining us today, and now it is truly my honor and privilege to welcome Amanda Markowitz Wizenberg. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Michael. Michael's been absolutely instrumental in helping me with my presentation, and he's a real wealth of knowledge, so I'm really grateful to him. So thank you, Michael. Hello. As Michael said, my name is Amanda Markowitz Wizenberg. Louder? Okay. Is that better? Yes? Okay. My name is Amanda Markowitz Wizenberg. I'm here with the Holocaust Museum LA, which Michael already mentioned how that was founded. I want to thank you all for having me here to speak to you today. It's really a privilege, and I am grateful for the opportunity to honor my grandmother by sharing her story of survival. For those who may not know, and I'm sure many of you do, just a little bit of a background. The Holocaust was an event that took place between 1933 and 1945, where Nazi Germany and their collaborators murdered 6 million Jews, 1.5 million of which were children. I am the granddaughter of 4 Holocaust survivors, which has been a very big part of my life, and each of whom have a very incredible story of loss and survival. But today I will be sharing one of their stories, the story of my mother's mother. My mother is here, my sisters. My Nana, Tonia Kohn, who is here with me in this photo. Tonia Rosenblatt. Okay, so how many of you love candy? It's okay, you can raise your hands. You don't have to if you don't love it. I love candy. And my whole family does too. I always have, most likely because my grandmother always carried these little strawberry candies with her. There was always a crystal candy bowl filled up in her home. She just loved candy. And that was probably because growing up, her parents owned a seltzer and candy shop. So I believe that candy was always her way to reconnect to her beautiful, happy childhood, which was quickly stolen from her simply because she was Jewish. My grandmother was born in 1922 in Łódź, Poland, where Jews made up 1/3 of the population. Łódź was a dynamic industrial city where Jews were thriving and operating many of the city's factories. Łódź's Jews also actively participated in politics, and the city was a center of Jewish literature, theater, artistic activity. And in these photos, you can see a thriving city. There's children at summer camp, smiling and dancing, Orthodox children playing chess with a non-Jewish child, a man at a newspaper stand selling papers in Hebrew. Life was normal. So as you can see on this map, before the war began, there were over 200,000 Jews in Łódź, 33% of the population, like I mentioned before. Łódź is right there. So to put things in perspective, after the Holocaust, only 10%, or close to 20,000 Jews, remained. My Nana had a wonderful childhood. Great parents, an older brother, Froim, and an older sister, Malka. This is the only photo that I have of my grandmother's parents. It was taken right before the war in 1939 and sent to her big sister, Malka, who had already moved to Israel in 1935. Which is why she isn't in the photo. My Nana said that while they weren't rich, she lived a comfortable life. Her father, Luzer, was a very religious man who was often at temple, and her mother, Chaya, lovingly raised her children. They were a welcoming family, and every Shabbat, they would invite people over who had nowhere to go. As a young girl, she loved to go to the movies with her friends from school. At 14 years old, she would help at her family's seltzer and sweet store, selling seltzer water, chocolates, and candies. She had a normal life, a beautiful life. But at just 17 years old, my grandmother's entire life began to change. On September 8th, 1939, 1 week after Germany invaded Poland, German troops occupied her hometown of Łódź. She remembers their black boots stomping on the ground. And suddenly, Jews couldn't leave the city without special permission. They couldn't own cars or radios, and their bank accounts were blocked. Children could no longer attend school, synagogues were destroyed, and all Jewish-owned enterprises were taken over by the Germans. Most likely that seltzer shop as well. Jews were oppressively required to wear a yellow Star of David whenever leaving their home in an effort to identify and degrade them. In February 1940, when my grandmother should have been enjoying the beginning of her adulthood at just 18 years old, the Germans established a ghetto in Łódź, and the street she lived on became a part of that ghetto, which meant her entire family was in the ghetto. About 160,000 Łódź Jews were forced into a small area that was supposed to only fit 8,500 people. A few months later, on April 30th, 1940, the ghetto was officially sealed. She was no longer to go anywhere and was forbidden from using public transportation. The ghetto was severely insulated from its surroundings. It was lined with barbed wire fencing, making sure nobody could get in or out. Living conditions were horrendous. Hard labor, overcrowding, starvation all became a dominant feature of my grandmother's life. And it became clear that with Hitler came the end of her childhood and the beginning of immeasurable loss. In the Łódź ghetto, Germans established factories and used the Jews for forced labor, receiving meager food rations in return. My grandmother first worked in a shop sewing and hemming dresses, and then she was sent to a carpet factory where she made big carpets for the Germans. It was a terrifying 30-minute walk for her as she passed soldiers, keeping her head down, staying out of trouble. She worked there for nearly 3 years. Her brother's job was to weigh the food that was distributed, so he was able to bring home a little extra food. But even with that, they were still starving, especially her father, who had gotten very skinny and weak. He went to bed one night and told her, "I want to pray. Give me a tallis," because he was very religious. He prayed, he took off the tallis, and then he went to sleep. And when she woke up in the morning, he was dead. And like her father, about 20% of the population in this ghetto died of starvation. Ghetto life was terrifying, and each day brought something horrific. Every morning she would get up and put makeup on her mother in the hopes of making her look younger so she wouldn't be taken away. She felt her job was to protect her mother, especially now that she had lost her father. You never knew when something terrible could happen. One day, her best friend, Mara, was walking down the street from work, and a German man hit her over the head and killed her, just like that in the street, for no reason. She heard in the ghetto that they were even throwing babies out of hospital windows. Life was unimaginably difficult, and my grandmother lived this way in the ghetto for 4 years. In the spring of 1944, when my grandmother was 21 years old, the Nazis decided to destroy the Łódź ghetto. About 4 months prior, my grandmother's brother had been taken from work and deported to a concentration camp, so it was just her and her mother. Concentration camp, as many of you might know, is a place where the Nazis imprisoned the Jews with the intent to provide forced labor or await mass execution. My grandmother remembers the last day in the ghetto before being deported. The Germans had a sign that said, "If you don't leave, you'll be killed tomorrow." Her mother didn't want to leave, but my grandmother knew they had no choice. She took what she could in a backpack, some clothes and photos, and her mother took 2 pots, 2 spoons, and 2 knives, so that wherever they were going, she could cook kosher food. They were very unaware of what awaited them. The Nazis gave everyone a little bit of bread, which made my grandmother feel hopeful. Surely nothing could be worse, so she was happy to be leaving this terrible ghetto. But then she saw the kennel trains that would take them away. She couldn't believe how many people were being packed in them. She remembers how hot it was, and there was just one tiny window at the top which she couldn't reach. She was packed in there like that for 3 days and 3 nights. She held on to her bread for as long as she could to make it last. And when the train finally stopped, the doors opened to this. She had arrived at Auschwitz. to a scene that looked very similar to this photo. There were SS men all around with boots stomping and barking dogs surrounding everyone. There was a fence with skinny women behind it screaming for her bread. My grandmother, as hungry as she was, threw them her bread that she had been holding onto for days. Despite it all, she managed to maintain her humanity. By the train tracks of Auschwitz, my Nana stood alongside her mother, clutching her arm, while the selection process took place. This was where they determined who was fit for work and who was not. So in this photo, you see this woman and this child. This is what affects me the most about this photo, because you know they've just been sent off to their death because they're not strong enough to go work. So an officer came with a flashlight in my grandmother's eyes and pulled her away from her mother, separating them. Her mother said, "Go, go, you'll see me soon." But that was the last time she ever saw her mother. She was then taken into a room where she was told to undress and then given a very hot shower. She remembers being naked while the Nazis laughed and took photos of her. She was then assigned a wooden bunk bed and given a piece of bread and a blanket, and she saved her bread again and slept with it as a pillow. But in the morning it was gone. Someone had stolen it. Every single morning at Auschwitz, they would be woken up at 5 a.m. to stand outside and be counted, even if it was freezing. They would give one woman a pot of soup to take some and pass it down the line. But by the time it got to my grandmother, who was at the end of the line, she remembers sometimes only getting a drop of soup. One day she was taken on a train with about 50 girls and sent to another camp in the forest near Hanover, Germany. My grandma remembers it being beautiful there compared to Auschwitz. She was always asking when she'd see her mother, not understanding where she had been taken. The soldiers told her mother was nearby taking care of children, so she believed that, and she would spend her time looking for her mother wherever she went. She believed she would find her one day, but of course she never did. After about 5 weeks, they closed this camp and she was put on an army truck and sent to another camp where they had forced labor. She remembers that camp being much worse than the previous one. She was first sent to work down in a salt mine, digging salt with a shovel from one pile to another, and the next day back from the other pile to the other pile. It was completely useless work in an attempt to further dehumanize her. She was then sent into a forest where she was forced to dig 5-foot deep ditches, put cables in them, then cover them with cement blocks. It was taxing work, especially since they were starving. But she remembers one soldier named White Hans who would bring her a little extra bread, and she always felt happy when he was there. She was there for quite a long time working in the forest like that. But then this camp was closed and she was deported yet again. Oops, sorry. This time she was marched to Bergen-Belsen, where conditions were extremely brutal. Throughout her entire experience at forced labor camps, she still didn't know about death camps, where people were being murdered. It was at Bergen-Belsen that she was told that all the mothers and fathers had been murdered, including her own. This truth absolutely devastated her. When she arrived, she was put in a room with straw on the floor and no roof. She slept there for a night, and then the Nazis said they were going to all be taken on a boat to Sweden. One woman said she couldn't walk anymore, so they let her stay behind and said to choose one person to stay with her. She picked my grandmother because she'd recognized her. They'd coincidentally lived on the same street in Łódź before the war. All the other women, a few hundred women, were taken on that boat, killed, and dumped in the water. They were never going to Sweden. It was a lie to get them on the boat. At Bergen-Belsen, it was a terrible life. SS women were unbelievably mean to them. They would make them clean toilets with their hands, and she often saw girls beaten and thrown out into the freezing cold. But my Nana said she was like a sheep. She stayed in line, she stayed quiet, so nothing would happen to her. She listened, she followed orders, because otherwise she could get a bullet. At Bergen-Belsen, she recognized a girl she knew from Łódź named Tamara, who's on the right there. They became inseparable, and they looked out for each other. It was comforting to see a familiar face, and they stuck together, sharing a bunk. She had a group of women there who became like sisters, including Tamara, Ella, and Astusha. My grandmother feels so lucky to have had Tamara because she had a job as a nurse in the camp, which was critical for her survival. My grandmother got typhus, and nobody thought she would live. She remembers having a dream where her mother was outside the window knocking and telling her she would be okay, but that a soldier wouldn't let her mother in. And somehow, in real life, a man came and gave her shots with medicine, likely because of Tamara, and she was okay, just like her mother said in her dream. Even though she was okay, she had a very hard time maintaining hope. She was scared all the time, she was never sure if she would live, and there were times she just wanted to die. But she did her best to stay strong, and it was important to her to help others stay strong too. She and Tamara would get bread from sick patients who didn't eat and give it to people who needed the sustenance. Her friend Ella attributes her survival to my Nana because when she was sick, my grandmother gave her soup and bread. One morning on April 15th, 1945, when my Nana was 22 years old, the English showed up, and the prisoners were told they were liberated. They were free. The English soldiers told them that the Germans had poisoned the bread that was going to be served the next day. They were one serving away from being killed. The English came with packages of food, but the first thing my grandmother asked for was a piece of matzah, because she somehow knew it was Passover. My grandmother spoke of being really mad at God throughout her experience. Having grown up religious, she wondered where God was, why her father had died, why her mother was taken and murdered. She was so lonely and so hurt, and many times she didn't want to live, and yet she asked for matzah. Because through it all, being Jewish was still important to who she was. They didn't take that away from her. The war was over, but my grandmother said part of her didn't even care because she'd lost everything. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know what she was going to do. She didn't know what it meant that it was the end of the war. Fortunately, she had this group of girls who were now her family. They all stayed together in Bergen-Belsen, which became a displaced persons camp, where Jews stayed following the war since they had nowhere to go, as they tried to find any surviving family members. In June of 1945, men started coming to the women's camps to find their loved ones. My grandmother's brother, Froim, came to find her, and she couldn't believe he was alive. My grandmother said it was like heaven to see him. Then Tamara's brother, Nathan, came to find her. Tamara had been told her brother was killed in Auschwitz. So when he walked in, she saw him, and she fainted because she couldn't believe he was still alive. This is when my grandmother met Nathan. Tamara had always said she would be a perfect match for her brother, and she was right. They ended up together, and Nathan is my grandfather. After my grandparents met, they would tell stories. And while she felt bitter, my grandmother also now had a reason to live. He gave her hope. They stayed there at Bergen-Belsen, which was now a displaced persons camp, for 6 months until December 1945, when they moved to Malberg, Germany. They got married soon after that on March 3rd, 1946, which is also my grandfather's birthday, and later the same date they would come to the US. It's a special day in my family's life. They had a beautiful religious wedding. They got married in a big temple with friends, soldiers, and musicians. The girls she survived with, now like sisters, made her a white dress and a veil from a curtain. She said it was a normal wedding that her parents would have wished for her. Living in Germany was ultimately too hard for my grandmother. It was too painful to hear the German language, to hear the stomping of those black boots on the ground that she remembered so vividly. So after living there for 2 years, they decided to leave. My grandfather had an uncle in New York, and they were able to get a visa to go there. Tamara had been able to go to Los Angeles, and shortly after, she asked them to come, so they ended up moving to Los Angeles, where they ultimately settled. Having survived without a dollar, they managed to save up a little bit for a 2-bedroom apartment, where they had 2 children, my uncle Lenny and my mother Libby, who both went on to have 3 daughters each, giving my grandparents 6 granddaughters. I'm the youngest of the 6. In raising her children and grandchildren, like many survivors, she didn't like telling the stories of her trauma. Instead, she wanted to move forward. She did believe that being a refugee, she raised her children with more love than anyone ever could. She fought to give us everything, and she never wanted to deprive us of anything. My grandmother did go back to Łódź, and she found the grave of her father that they had managed to make when he died in the ghetto, thanks to an individual who donated funds to go and mark all these graves. In spite of losing her parents, family members, and friends, my grandmother was as sweet as the little candy she carried in her purse. The candies that most likely connected her to her childhood sweet shop. In spite of everything she endured, she was gentle and calm, and she always carried so much love in her heart. In spite of the many nightmares she suffered each night for the rest of her life, she went on to live a beautiful Jewish life like the one she came from. I am the last generation to have heard the stories of my grandparents' survival directly from the witnesses themselves. Elie Wiesel said that whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. I am now a witness, and I have an obligation to share their stories and to be their voice. I am continually piecing together the puzzle that is my grandparents' past. There's still so much I don't know, and I will be trying to grasp what happened to them for the rest of my life. What I do know is I am proud to be the grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors. My husband, Andy, who's here, is also the grandchild of 4 survivors, making our children the great-grandchildren of 8 survivors. Truly miracles. In April of 2018, my husband and I embarked on the March of the Living, with David Ravanchanas in the back leading our group, an annual education program that brings individuals from around the world to Poland to study the Holocaust. I saw her hometown of Łódź and visited one of the only remaining synagogues. I walked in her footsteps to the Radegast train station where she departed from the Łódź ghetto with her mother and arrived at Auschwitz where they were separated forever. That's the train station, and these are the kennel cars that they were put in. On the train tracks of Auschwitz, my husband and I sat silently together, contemplating how this could have happened, and wondering how our grandparents had narrowly escaped death and found the strength to survive. I am beyond blessed that I was able to both enter and exit Auschwitz, a free woman, safely wrapped in the Israeli flag. I can't imagine how tormented my grandparents were and how haunted they were for the rest of their lives. But I find some semblance of peace in knowing they were able to rebuild and have a life filled with so much love. I will forever keep their stories alive and honor their legacy, as well as the legacies of the many people who perished. And I will do everything I can to create a world where never again is a reality for the Jewish people and for all people. Jews have been around for 4,000 years and have consistently been targeted. Anti-Semitism did not begin with the Holocaust, and it did not end with the Holocaust. And if you remember anything from my story today, I hope you remember that history has to be taken seriously, to remember the mistakes of the past, to better our future. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you and your family for allowing your grandmother's story to be a part of our museum. Thank you so much, everybody.